Right, I'm going to kick off the afternoon with the first of our panel discussions, which means me handing over the reins to the moderator for this session. That's Sérgio Ramos, who's the head of engineering at YLD. Please welcome on stage your panel. And Sérgio, thank you.
Growth, culture, and as companies grow, there needs to be an acknowledgement of management as a function, but also as a career path, long before you build a management roster. When does this need to happen? Oh, sorry, before that, I'm sorry, I need to present everyone. So, Sarah, do you want to talk about yourself?
So I'm Sarah, I'm the CTO at GPass. We're currently a very, very small startup. In my previous role as CTO at Oxy Health, we grew the business from around 10 people when I joined through to over 100 when I left. So we did a lot of reorganization and changes to the management structure during that time.
Robin?
Yes, so I'm Robin. I was happy to go straight into the talking without the introduction, but it's fine. So yeah, I'm Robin. I've been leader of technology at TravelPerk for fast approaching 2 years at this point. Prior to that, I was working in a smaller travel company called Click Travel, based out of Birmingham. So I've sort of been in this sort of engineering and then leadership role for around 17 years right now. And yeah, TravelPerk, 1,500 people, 350-ish in sort of technology and product and engineering. Yeah, and that's me.
James.
Hello, I'm James, Director of Engineering at Shopify. Got an org of a few hundred people. I'm based in Cumbria, so this is busier than I'm used to. I've written a couple of books. You can Google me. I'm not going to spend loads of time on that. And previously to this, I did the whole kind of seed round engineer through to VP-Eng. We exited a company called Brandwatch in 2021. We exited about 450 million. So I've done the sort of the small company to exit, and now I'm at the sort of the big company doing my thing there.
Thanks, James. Hi, I'm Usman. I'm the Director of Engineering at WorldPay. I've been there 3 years. I support teams focusing on machine learning products, and that's what I've been doing for the last 15, 20 years. I've worked at early stage startups and focusing on deep tech, AI, and building products. Teams of sizes from 10 to 125, and really look forward to our discussions.
And lastly, Dan, but not least.
Thank you. I'm really worried about falling off this massive step next to me. I'm kidding, it's fine. So I'm Dan, I'm Director of Engineering at Gymshark. I joined Gymshark about 3 years ago. I was employee 420-ish. At that point, Gymshark's now about 11 years old, but from that point, sort of 3 years ago to now, Gymshark's more than doubled in size in terms of employee. Prior to that, I worked with public service, government, NHS, so I did 7 years there trying to do agile software development with government, and now I run at 1,000 miles an hour with over $1 billion brand. So it's quite a transition, but it was super interesting to go from something massively regulated to something that is fast-paced, retail, massive, still one of the fastest growing companies in the UK. So yeah, super excited to be here.
And Dan's one of my customers, so I have to be especially nice.
Sergio's one of ours.
Oh, God.
Anybody else want to play?
Yeah, and so as I was saying, as companies grow, they need to start thinking about management not only as a career, but as a specialty, as a function. When do you think this needs to happen? When they think that leadership needs to pass on the values to create new leaders? I'm going to start with Robin.
Yeah, so I think it's an important thing to highlight that firstly, leadership is not management in the same way that mentorship is not management. These are really different things. I would probably start and contradict everything that we will come on to later, in that you don't have to start with management as early as you think. There'll be a lot of people in this room who will be focused on, you're a startup, you're a seed, you've got to get your product out the door. and sitting and thinking about what is the really complex management structure that I need to build up in order to do that is not going to gain you any favours. Yeah, so there is a point in time at which it's less important and you value moving quickly, and then there is that time where you find yourself in multiple offices, multiple teams. You start stretching over multiple projects, and that tends to be the tipping point for where it's helpful. It's hard for me to put a number on it, like what is the size of a team that needs to really focus on management. You know, the 20, 30 people, I think you start to struggle. 50, 80, 100 people, no chance. Like, management is an absolutely critical part to your infrastructure. But I would just say don't start too early. Would be my first piece of advice.
Otherwise, you're creating the wrong incentives too early.
Absolutely, because what you're after leadership. Yeah, you're not after management. You're after leadership to evangelize, to bring on, and to develop, and just get people rallied behind that idea. Yeah, you're really looking for the entrepreneur spirit. You're looking for the development of that product. You're less concerned at that point about structure and process and careers and development. It becomes important once you've got that idea off the ground.
Dan, any input?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely something we've had to pay a lot of attention to over the past couple of years, and kind of that, how do you scale that up when you're sort of a little bit bigger than that? When everyone's focused, as you say, like small scale, everyone's got their hands in the product and doing the thing. Management sort of becomes implied in terms of you're all there, like hands-on tools and doing the thing. Where we've had to navigate that change, there's certainly a very conscious effort to go, once you're at a bigger scale, how do you embed the values that you want other people to lead by very, very early? So that as you're developing people, and as we sort of come on to like how do you train people, coach people, find the right people into those roles, how do you start as early as possible advocating for the sort of culture and like the way we do things here, values, and they come out in those early days as well to go, you have to sort of reflect on the established culture as well to go like, is this going to sustain us past those tipping points as well as we go through those points of growth? There's those inflection points that say the culture we set then will not get us to where we need to be. One of the things I've started to look much more deeply at is, you know, when people talk about management structure or leadership structures and splitting teams, is people often draw org charts, and they'll often say, well, like it needs to be this and the team needs to be that. Starting instead looking at the interaction model between teams. Like, where does the communication happen? Where are the pinch points? Where does that happen? And a lot of it is drawn out in team topologies. If people have read that, great. If you haven't, recommend you absolutely go and do. But looking at your architecture, looking at the interaction modes and models that you have in your organization that have naturally emerged, and reflecting on the culture you have. And a blend of all those things ends up telling you some pretty good stories about where you should head as well, but also where those challenges are going to be. If you've got a culture set out from early doors and you've grown through, say, a startup phase and you've had accelerated growth, how do you make sure you reflect very critically on the things that got you there and whether they're going to get you to where you need to be as well?
Usman?
Yeah, completely agree with what Robin and Dan has said. I think everything needs to achieve something. It has a sense of purpose, right? So, for example, if you're an early stage startup and you're at that point where you're going to either have product market fit or some other form of success versus, okay, it may not work out. I think building too much structures there will be problematic because you're bringing in people which basically may or may not be needed, right? The second thing is that there are other ways of achieving things, because I think even if you're a 10, 20 people company, there is a CTO. Maybe that CTO was a lead developer stepping into the role. There's growth there. You know, there are places like CTO Craft where you can get mentorship from guys, CTOs and gals, where basically you don't actually need to hire. So the mentorship happens. And then the second thing is, again, as your purpose changes, you need to say, again, now growing to 50, 100 people. And then I think very consciously you need to build in those management capabilities. And I would go back to what Robin said, leadership capabilities. Because I think if you just leave leadership to managers, the sense of ownership drops, a sense of purpose drops. So there should be leadership everywhere, ICs owning the projects, delivering on projects, senior ICs, making sure that architecture and everything is really crisp. And then the management layer that is thinking about people, thinking about process, thinking about how growth is going to happen, and, you know, how people are having different conversation, how to manage conflict, things like that, and, you know, coaching and mentoring. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Anyone has any reflection?
No, I'm +1 to what everyone has said, and I think, like, if you're an early stage company that hasn't found product market fit, spending any of your brain cycles on what your management structure should look like is really not where you should be investing your time.
Yeah.
And I think, Robin, what you were saying, you know, get to the point where it's starting to break a bit before you put management in, because then you can say that this is a remedy to a problem that we have, as opposed to setting up a situation where you have teams that say, I do X, I do Y, and then you pivot, and then all of a sudden you've got a whole lot of people doing X that don't do X anymore, and you've got another problem on your hands. Whereas if you're in more fluid configuration, then you can weather the early days a lot easier.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. I think at the early stages of an organisation, it is about that leadership and about figuring out what you want to be in the world. And once you start to get to that and the communication perhaps starts to break down, the organisational structure doesn't work anymore, you'll be able to figure out the right management structures that fit your organisation and your growth.
But before you put those management structures, how can you find the right leaders? How can you try to put their mentality in them of thinking about being leaders and starting to train for it?
I think in terms of starting to train and identify the leaders, there's often opportunities, I think, to experiment with sort of small projects, helping on board with new members of the team. And then you can identify those people who are able to coach, who are willing to step in and give that person that support, who will give kind of slightly challenging feedback at times when it's needed. And that really, I found to be a really useful way to help identify people who are on a sort of engineering management trajectory. And you can open conversations with them then to see if that's what they also want to do, or if they wish to stay as an individual contributor.
Anyone? Another thing that is very common is for companies to kind of force their individual contributors' career into management, and sometimes they're not inclined or they're not inspired for it. How do you build a credible career path that allows for individual contributors to choose what they want to go and not dilute management with people that might not be very inclined to that career? Robin?
Yes. So I think the interesting, people often talk to me, how do you build a career framework for IT? Like, the career framework and the growth is what already existed for individual contributors, and what came along was people started trying to bolt management onto the side, and that's the growth you get. This is what I mean about contradicting what I was going to say earlier. You spend a whole load of time as a startup going, oh, I don't need to think about that, I don't need to think about that. And then you suddenly have to convince the same people that you've just said you don't need to think about it to invest in management. And so what immediately happens, you go, oh, well, you know, just do it part-time. And it becomes a hat. Yeah, I'm a manager once a week. I'm a manager twice a week. And the only people that you can get to do that are the best people that you've already got. And the only measurement for best are all of your ICs. And so what happens is you take away from the IC career path. And there's always the adage of you end up getting promoted to one level above what you're really good at. And then there's this bit where it's like, oh, you reach a point and somebody takes you away from what you're really good at. So I would say is don't think of it as how do I build a career path that helps an IC succeed in what they're doing. Instead, think of it as how do I build my management career path so that it doesn't influence and take away from the IC career path that does already exist? We already know what, if I focus on engineering, what staff level, what principal, what fellow level, these concepts already exist. They're not new. What we need to do is just stop distracting from it with, yeah, but it'd be really nice if you could be a manager once a week. Because I guarantee it, your best ICs make terrible managers.
It's almost avoiding the Peter principle, right?
Exactly.
James, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so, plus one on the dual career track idea. I appreciate at smaller companies it's hard to start saying, oh, this is what a distinguished engineer is when you've only got like 10 people. It doesn't make too much sense. But it has to evolve, with the company. But going back to the original question, which is that if you have that Venn diagram of like technical expertise and then managerial expertise and then in the middle is leadership, what you were saying, it's important also that your dual career ladders, and if you want to see examples, you've not seen them before, go on progression.fyi. There's tons of companies on there. I think I'm still the author of the Brandwatch one, I think, to see how those are stacked up, and they progress in parallel. But for these things to work, the ICs have to have actual roles that make sense with leadership. So there's lots of different staff engineer archetypes on Will Larson's blog in the staff engineer book of the kind of the right-hand engineer, the solver, the architect, and so on. That's really good reading if you haven't seen it already. But just as an example at Shopify, dual career track, I'm a director, my IC counterpart is a principal. I know what my principal engineer gets paid because they report to me. We get paid the same, pretty much there and thereabouts. So you have to compensate both the same. And I think also what's important to not force people down the wrong track is that you identify in your career track what levels are kind of considered to be like tenure or like terminal. So it's perfectly acceptable to be a senior engineer for 20 years as long as your pay keeps going up. But a lot of the bug that comes into the system is that the only way to get more money is to go to the next level, when actually, really, when you start to get to staff engineer, the same as in management, like you are in a leadership role. And then you end up with a job title inflation and people doing that role that shouldn't be doing it. So you need to understand like where your tenure levels are, ensure that you can keep progressing in pay, and then you end up with an org structure and a career track that makes sense. Otherwise, you end up with a bit of a muddle.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to what James said. So I was leading a drug discovery startup that used AI and quantum physics for drug discovery. And so this particular problem, I know James mentioned that if you have 10 people, the staff level concept for traditional engineering doesn't make sense. But actually in that situation, what happened was we had postdoc researchers in quantum physics and machine learning basically needed to be like, needed to push the boundary, publish that research. And so I had to make sure that basically their technical leadership is recognized. So to what James said, basically having the right compensation, having that distinguished track, right? Because distinguished track is about impact, and usually those distinguished track make sense when you're at the size of maybe Shopify, WorldPay, big larger companies. But you might have very niche startups, which in order for them to succeed, need to attract that really niche talent. And that niche talent may not want to do people or traditional management. They really want to own and impact the problem, the complex problems they're solving. So you build multiple tracks. Then you also have a very clear way of how decisions are made. Because what can happen is when you have a world expert in a very niche problem and they might have actually differing opinions, management that is not best placed to make a decision, can't jump in and say, this is how we're going to make a decision. So I think decision-making mechanism to support those tracks need to happen themselves, because usually, management steps in when, project isn't going anywhere, architecture differences, senior engineers are in a deadlock, James, Robin, or someone has to step in and say, hey guys, we need to make progress. Let's push this forward. So I think that also helps, having those both tracks.
So I already mentioned a little bit about identifying, which is a good answer, but also about coaching the new leaders. Usman, do you have any insights on how to coach future leaders?
Yeah, I think so. Coaching is very individual, so you have to know the person. So one-to-ones are a great place to start knowing people, and then also, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what they think they are, and then hopefully they've adapted a growth mindset, and you give them feedback on what that is. I think if you embed a culture of what Robin talks about, leadership, right? So individual contributors can lead and deliver on a project, senior ICs. So that actually gives you some signals around what their capabilities in terms of project management is, not heavy project management but if they're delivering a feature for a particular product, they have to have some timeline skills, getting people in a room kind of skills. So I think those are good signals for you to see. And then, so what you then do is basically base a very customized personal development plan for those individuals. Now, you will have a bunch of things, a bunch of people on your roster that you will need to build, right? So there are signals that you need to listen to, but you need to do your own planning in order for that to be effective. So if I, as a leader, don't plan an error budget, think about, people are going to try new things, they're going to become managers, they're going to make mistakes. If there's no room to make errors, then it's going to be very difficult for them to succeed. So budgeting, think of it, car, if you drive a car, you have fines. If you just budget for fines, you won't be that stressed. So in your yearly plan, if you've got people that are going to step up, what projects that you can give them and give them to actually succeed initially. Secondly, in your yearly plan, actually have some error budgets. And then, you have those two tracks. It shouldn't be a door that shuts behind you. You go into management, if you try it, if it doesn't actually work out, you actually go into the IC role that you're doing. And usually one thing that really helps is the lagging sort of responsibilities kind of thing. So, yeah.
Does anyone have any other insights?
I was just going to add that if you don't already do some kind of formal succession planning, it's like a really good exercise. I was really skeptical at first, so I'd never done it before Shopify, but once a quarter I have to keep, exec updated with, if I left, who takes my place and what's the effect on my org. And that's actually just a really nice work backwards, because you identify the high growth people, you understand where the gaps are, if there are any. I signify I fortunately have a great bench of people, but if there was nobody to take my place, I have to flag that. And then part of my job then is to kind of keep my network warm of who would I bring in if I left, sort of thing. So
forces you to think backwards.
Yeah, it's a good exercise. It's well worth doing.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on it, but what have been your approaches to staggering managerial transitions and ensuring that they remain reversible to both parties? Sarah?
So I had a really interesting experience with this. When in my last role I found out I was pregnant. To Robin's point, we'd been through quite a rapid growth, so we'd gone from a team of 20 to a little over 40, and in the process of that, we had not worried about management, so I had 13 direct reports. We knew we were going to get an interim in. It was just very apparent that pleasantly handing over to my interim 13 direct reports, one of whom was like a really junior apprentice, was probably not an optimal solution. So we went through a very rapid process of what should a kind of reorg look like, and transitioned such that I only had 5 direct reports. And it was a story really of two tales when I came back from maternity leave. There were a couple of people who had completely flourished under their new responsibilities. They had taken to it like a duck to water. One of them was a career changer. He'd done it before, and his team just loved having him as their lead, and that was great. And there was another guy where I came back, and I think he left it a week, to be fair to him, before he said, "Can we have lunch?" And he's just like, "I hate it. These people are coming to me with their problems, and I don't want to solve it, and I have to do all these meetings and write up all this, and can I just go back to DevOps?" And so we just put back in place a plan to move him back to being a senior IC, but also then communicating to the organization about that transition and why that had taken place, just so that he didn't kind of have a sense of a loss of face, and it was, everybody knew that he was much happier with his head in the weeds in the code. But it was a really interesting experience to kind of set everything up, step away for 9 or 10 months, come back, and it was this tale of two halves.
James, any insights?
Yeah, I guess building on top of that, so, using a safety net in some way, that if people want to try management for the first time, the opportunity's there, you can say, sure thing, like, why don't we do this for 6 months, and then we'll see whether you like it, whether it's working for me as well, whether the team likes it, and so on. And having, like, a very transparent setup works pretty well. I guess, and you can also start to distribute small amounts of leadership responsibilities to emergent ICs so they can demonstrate that leadership. But the thing that is especially tricky, I think, now in the current climate, we've just come off of the biggest bull run of 15 years and redundancies are happening. I've been in the center of all of that at Shopify as well. If you do that too much and then you end up with lots of people, with managers of 2 people, managers of 1 person, and then growth stops, you've effectively put your staff in a position that's incredibly difficult for them in their career. So I think in terms of like slow transition into management, only ever really do it if there is a real role at the end. You often get the direct report, like, I want to try management, I'll give you a person. And then a year later there's a round of layoffs and they pick the people who don't have enough wingspan in the org. You've basically just made someone get fired. So you have to be really mindful of that position and only really execute on that if it's going to be all right in the long term.
Isn't it easier to give that responsibility to that person when you have a need for that responsibility to exist, rather than trying to force it into, let's put someone under you just because you want to do management?
I mean, that's true. I think the reality is it's always a two-way thing, isn't it? If you've got a really superstar IC that really wants to become a manager, you want to keep them, you want to give them opportunities, but you have to also really draw that hard line of, okay, really, actually, a managerial position needs to represent a business purpose. It's either that it's the team that owns this thing or runs this project, or they exist for a reason. If you start to sort of fragment your org with like managers in training with no real end game in sight, then I think you end up with a problem in the future that's really hard to rectify.
Yeah. Dan, any ideas?
Yeah, so there's a very tangible, practical, recent one where we did almost exactly that. We knew that we had a couple of people who had expressed an interest in wanting to manage a team sort of level. So we staggered it over a period of, say, 6 months, and kind of incrementally every 2 months just gave them an additional person. And the first couple of steps were just about going, if you've never managed someone before, let's give you someone really easy to manage. And I use that term loosely. Everyone's got their challenges. Like that incremental step of going, let's give you someone relatively easy and stable and probably relatively experienced, so that you can just learn the practicalities of like hands-on management. Like, if you've never done one-on-ones before, like, just go and get in the rhythm of just doing the really practical, simple things, but giving someone the space to do that. And we reduced their capacity in sprints. So they were in IC, and we just said, well, do you know what? Drop your capacity in sprints. So you're not doing it 1 day a week or this, and that. You can actually do it when you need to in a way that you would, and you can learn hands-on practical management experience alongside an existing engineering manager. And if you like it, we'll add a person. If you like it, we'll add a person. Eventually, we'll add one of those more challenging, more difficult individuals that I'm sure no one has in their organisation. and those kind of nuances around how do you manage not just straightforward people with a really clear trajectory, but how do you manage challenging people? How do you performance manage? And how do you lead at the same time? How do you generate role models? And I think the flip of that as well, especially as organisations get bigger, so it's probably not as prevalent in startup territory and smaller companies, but I wouldn't just think of this, and something we've really worked hard to try and do is, don't just think of this as like a tech problem. It's like, how do you actually partner with your HR or people team and use the mechanisms that you genuinely have in place? Like, do you have secondments? Do you have step-up allowances? Do you have acting up? Like, whatever concepts you have in that world, like, how do you actually compensate these people for stepping into the firing line, if you like, of doing something different and doing something challenging that's going to stretch them, but making sure they see the benefit of that and use the mechanisms and frameworks that organizations traditionally like shy away from, because we're engineers and we want to do something different and quirky, but actually there's some really useful structures in place to help businesses thrive, especially for moments like this. Like, if you've got policy, procedure, support in a formal sense, you can actually use it as the opportunity for other people as well, I think.
Any other insights?
Yeah, I was just going to add one more bit in that what I found really important was breaking the idea that actually moving back from management was a failure. And it was super. So for us, we did that in a really obvious way, in that our career framework is leveled not through titles, but through numbers. And the reality is that this IC track level here and this management level track here are the same level. Yeah, for us that's a 6. That's where that starts. It doesn't matter what your numbers are; it's irrelevant. But breaking this idea that it's a failure to try it and then go back was really important in opening up people's desire to try it, go for it, do anything else. Because that idea of, oh, it's got to work and I can't go back, so I will leave and go back to IC somewhere else, is a much worse situation.
So you're saying moving horizontally?
It's a this is the point of identifying it as 2 tracks. It is not a promotion into management or a promotion into this direction. You know, you have already worked in this industry. You've proved your experience, your craft to a particular level, yeah, and then you have moved in sideways effectively into the management arm of that, the IC arm of that, or you might go over into a completely different discipline, but making sure that the overall perception is that these things are equally as important is really critical.
And I think, James, it's more or less what you're saying with the 2 tracks.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. Like, in theory, people at the same level should be demonstrating the same amount of scope and impact, but the implementation of how they do it is varied.
Yeah.
And it's fine to be in either track. And actually, interestingly, at Shopify, like we, similar to Meta and a few other places, we did like a flattening in the last year where, we were actively encouraging people that individual contributor track. I mean, it's nice that the framework's in there already, that you get paid the same. There's no monetary incentive. We were trying to make that more prestigious, to say, hey, like, you want more flexibility in what you work on, you want more tangible impact, growth opportunities in a company that's not getting any bigger, be an IC. You can go all the way up the track without needing to manage anybody at all. Whereas if you're one of us weird manager people, we only exist if there is an org structure around us that opens up a seat that we can sit in, else we can't grow.
Yeah. Exactly. And kind of related, but how do you create an environment where people, rather than going, quotes, back to IC, they can make mistakes and learn doing those mistakes? Usman, do you have any insights?
Yeah, I think it's really relevant to the topic of culture. I think I was talking to Adam. He's going to do one of the talks here about growth mindset. I think it's about this culture where you reward people in trying different things, and failure as not being perceived as something very negative, right? And if you've budgeted within your plan as a leader for certain people to try different things and then move horizontally, I think that works really well. So the culture of actually the high growth mindset where we've tried and we've failed fast, and it's not just like we're still outcome focused, but we've learned something from it, right? So I think that's really kind of important, which is the fundamental. As a leader, you are getting people to push boundaries, and people can't push boundaries if they don't come out of their comfort zone. If they don't, and it's kind of like, if you go out of your comfort zone, you're gonna make mistakes. If your, success rate is 95%, you go out of your comfort zone, it's gonna come down, right? And then one of the things that we haven't really talked about is that, what material, what support is there in terms of coaching, mentoring, getting them, you put somebody into a management position, but have you gotten them, a manager circle that they can go talk to, right? Have you connecting them with mentors and things like that? So I think just this fear of failure, which is again culture, getting the right support is what makes for a successful.
Right. But regardless of how much support, not how much support, how much training or how much they read or how much coaching they get, there's still going to be mistakes.
Exactly.
So how can we allow them to make those mistakes and learn from it? James?
I mean, I think we've touched upon some of it, having a contract when somebody moves into managerial for the first time to say, hey, give this a go for a fixed period. Doors always open. I think that's where some people get afraid, is that you switch role and it's a different role to go to management and then feel that they're going to do a bad job and then they'll be the next one out the door. That's people get scared of that. So saying that really isn't the case. This is just, a different implementation of your current scope, your current impact. But I think, and as you were touched upon, making sure that there is peer support, confidential groups of other managers that can just talk about whatever they want off the record. All of this is super important to give that feeling of psychological safety and feeling that, you're not alone.
Yeah, and it's above else. It's people. It's not like you can submit a patch request to fix a bug. How does this approach apply to external hires through bought into management straight away? Dan?
I think there's some interesting balance especially when you get this kind of, we talk a lot about how do you bring people through on IT track and this kind of thing. I think there's something we've tried to do to mitigate the idea of assuming that ICs will move on to say a management track if you created one at the right sort of time, which is also where else in the org are you going to get people from? Because certainly I've brought in we've collectively shifted our concepts and prerequisite for an engineering manager to be a lot more delivery focused than engineering and technical focused. And a lot of that's because of the dynamic of the organization. But I think when you're bringing people in, whether it's external to tech, but still internal to the org, or completely externally, just helping people understand about the reality of it. And what I mean by that is this kind of notion of how you should manage people and how you should lead people. And we all read 1,000 books on how that should happen, and we have discussions like this. And then there's the reality of the day-to-day of having a team and real humans and emotions and everything else that goes on. And there's I need to actually get a thing done. And we talk a lot about the concept of there's the maybe written policies, procedures, ways of getting things done. And then there's the real way of getting the thing done. Which is the person who works in X finance team who happens to be best mates with the person over there, where when you're really up against it, having a really good relationship with that person is going to matter. So helping people understand that they're going to be taught and consume a way that the organisation works. They come in as an external, they're learning the organisation. But on the face of it, there's another kind of game within the game of how does this organisation really work? What's the real underlying culture? What's that network of communication and relationships that I need to build to be successful here? And that is a real opportunity for people to learn the dynamics of relationships and everything else. But I think the other one is that it's a challenge of inclusivity as well. It's a challenge of how do you make sure you're being fair through this whole process of how you bring people in and you change the culture and you affect how we're going to manage people and onboard people successfully without depleting the opportunity for people as well. And I think that's the same, to be fair, of how you give opportunities to ICs or on a management track. It's how do you make sure, and the point around succession planning, how do you bring people through and invest in them in succession plan, but do that in an inclusive way is something to be incredibly mindful about. It's how do you teach people and support people in understanding how does this organisation really work and how can I set you up for success by just going, have a coffee with that person, because I guarantee having a good relationship with X, Y, Z person will serve you really, really well in your career here.
Yeah. Usman, do you have any?
Yeah, so think of, if when hiring a new leader into your organization, it's a new turf, right? So, you can have a home game confidence and away game confidence. So away game, this is kind of like new person joining, everything's new, and for management, there's many different things to take on, right? So one of the things that I find it really useful is have a very well-defined project that they can deliver, and it's, very easy for them to deliver. So have a roadmap for that ready, give it to them, and that small win is just going to help them build their confidence in their away sort of, before it becomes a home turf. And what that win allows for them to display and build concretely their relationship with stakeholders, because they've done something, you've helped them do something, and then you've helped them display things to the stakeholder, right? And I think this also, there are common things which, you need to give a new manager. So this might be a very experienced leader, but they're new to this company. So having a buddying system, somebody that basically can sort of knows the place, been there, can help them. So onboarding this small wins, setting up conversations with stakeholders really helps onboard new leaders. So I think these steps really kind of worked for me.
It's about letting them know the culture, know the people that they need to know, and having a scoped project that allows them to navigate those waters.
Exactly. Display quick wins, display their skills very quickly.
Anyone has any? One last question. Hiring externally for your leadership positions versus promoting, how do you balance that? What is the risk of diluting the culture or hiring the wrong person as well? Does anyone have any insights into that?
I have a sort of, not a solution, but like a meta point, which is kind of you have to decide which roles are you comfortable accelerating internal high-growth candidates that already have all the context, that gives you the opportunity to get people who are not like a white man in the role. What kind of roles are those in your organization versus what are the ones where often at the senior end, you really do need to think about the external market as well to bring in like a diversity of thought and so on. And where you draw those lines as an organization is very much a factor of like your size, your market, what you do. I don't have the answer to that. I think I have a reasonable idea for Shopify, but balancing internal context and experience versus the kind of diversity of thought of an external candidate is really hard to measure. Because if you think about like the most open hiring process, every single promotion should be an external rec. You end up designing something that is probably used in your local council and like no one ever moves anywhere. So you have to think about where you can go fast and where you can go slow.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think it's part of like what's the risk you're willing to take? What are you willing to teach? But also remembering that, and this may be slightly controversial, like especially on this topic, but like not, especially as senior leaders, not every decision you make has to be in the interest of those individuals. So actually, yes, sometimes people are going to be disappointed because the business is your boss. Like the success of the business is your boss. So yes, you want to create opportunities, you want that opportunity to be there for people, but if the business doesn't exist long enough for you to create that opportunity, it's the wrong decision to make. So that trade-off of like, do I hire externally because I need this expertise now and I do not have time for someone to learn it, versus trying to balance that bias towards equally how do I give people the right opportunity to help them grow. And maybe they are that thing we need, we just don't know like that they're actually capable of that. It's a hard one to trade off, but I think just remembering in the back of our minds, like the business is our boss, they have to make decisions in the basis of the business first. There's opportunity to do that to support people in their growth, absolutely. And some businesses are the other way around, that's fine. But doing it in the context of the business you work for and the goal you're seeking.
Yeah. I don't think we have enough time. I was speaking at the Slido and I think we answered a bunch of questions already. So thank you. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Hannah, thank you.